Hello friends, I'm glad you're here tonight. Before we begin, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from right now? And what time is it where you are? I always find it fascinating to imagine people scattered across the world. Some may be listening in the late hours of the night while others are just waking up with the sun. Wherever you are, I want you to feel comfortable, to sit back, and to slowly drift into the story of what it might have been like to be an American pilot during the Second World War, and everything that came with that life. The story of a pilot in that era was never just about flying. It was about training, about friendships, about the strange foods eaten in distant places, about letters sent home, about the sounds and smells of the airfields, and about the way time seemed to stretch and collapse all at once. Imagine being a young man, perhaps only 19 or 20 years old, not long out of high school, and suddenly finding yourself dressed in a leather flight jacket with a pair of goggles perched on your head, walking across a runway lined with machines that seemed to roar like wild animals. In the United States, before a pilot ever touched the sky in Europe or the Pacific, he would spend long weeks in training. The training bases were scattered across the country: Texas, Arizona, Florida, places where the skies were usually clear. The days were filled with ground school classes that seemed endless. Navigation, meteorology, engine maintenance, even lessons on recognizing enemy aircraft from a distance. Nights were sometimes just as long, spent bent over maps by the dim glow of lamps, practicing with slide rules, or memorizing flight patterns. It was not glamorous, but it was necessary. The food at these training bases was simple, but it stuck in the memory of many men. Powdered eggs that had a chalky taste, thick slices of bread that never quite seemed fresh, coffee so strong it could keep someone awake through an entire night. Some bases had cooks who tried to make things better, and occasionally there would be a treat like apple pie or fried chicken on Sundays. But more often, meals were about fuel, about filling the stomach quickly before the next round of drills began. And the drills were endless. Hours of marching in formation beneath the hot sun, lifting weights and running to build endurance, learning to handle the parachute with the knowledge that one day that parachute might be the only thing between life and death. Pilots were reminded again and again that the aircraft was not always reliable, that engines could stall, that wings could tear, and that no matter how much confidence one felt in the machine, gravity was always waiting. Then there were the planes themselves. The first flights were usually in small trainers, with seats that smelled of oil and canvas, with propellers that sputtered until they found their rhythm. The student would climb in, heart pounding, while the instructor barked orders from the back seat. Sometimes it went well, sometimes not. There were crashes during training, accidents that never made it into newspapers but were spoken of quietly in the barracks at night. Every man understood, even before he saw combat, that flying was dangerous. Yet there was also exhilaration. Imagine climbing higher than you had ever been before, seeing the earth spread out below like a vast patchwork quilt. Rivers glinting in the sun, roads winding like thin threads, towns no larger than toy blocks. The cockpit wind would rattle against the helmet and goggles. And in those moments, a pilot could feel a strange mix of fear and freedom, as if the sky had become both enemy and friend. Evenings on the base brought their own rituals. Some men would gather in groups, singing old songs or strumming guitars if one was lucky enough to have an instrument. Others would write letters home to sweethearts or parents, pouring out hopes and frustrations in neat cursive handwriting. Cigarettes were common, smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling, and laughter would echo through the barracks as stories were told. Some true, some exaggerated. And then, of course, there was the anticipation of being sent overseas. Rumors spread constantly: who would be deployed to Europe, who would head to the Pacific, who might remain stateside to train new recruits. The waiting was almost worse than the fighting, because uncertainty could gnaw at the nerves. Some men packed their duffel bags weeks in advance, while others avoided thinking about it until orders came down. There were also whispers about the aircraft themselves, the heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress, which could take terrible punishment and still limp back to base. The nimble fighters like the P-51 Mustang, sleek and fast, said to be among the best planes in the world. The rugged P-40 Warhawks that carried the early fight in harsh conditions. Each type had its legends, and every pilot secretly hoped to be assigned to the one he admired most. But beyond the planes, beyond the drills and the endless waiting, life was also about small pleasures. Trips to the local town whenever there was leave, where pilots in crisp uniforms might stroll into diners or movie theaters. Milkshakes, hamburgers, jukeboxes playing the latest songs. These became treasures, reminders of a normal life that seemed farther away every day. Local girls sometimes danced with the pilots, and photographs were taken in booths where two heads leaned together, smiling as if war was just a distant rumor. Still, even in these moments, the shadow of the coming battles was never far away. There was a seriousness in the way men looked at each other, a recognition that many of them would never come home. This knowledge was unspoken, but it lingered in the quiet hours before sleep, when the laughter faded and the hum of distant planes could be heard in the night sky. Being a pilot in the Second World War was about so much more than flying missions. It was about stepping into a world where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided every day, where powdered eggs could sit side by side with the thrill of climbing above the clouds, where friendships were forged in the heat of training and tested in the fires of combat. And it was only the beginning of a journey that would take them across oceans, over battlefields, and into the pages of history. When orders finally arrived, everything seemed to move with a sudden rush, as if time that had once crawled now leapt forward without mercy. Pilots and crews were loaded onto trains, the sound of steel wheels clattering across the tracks echoing in their ears as America itself blurred past outside the windows. Fields, forests, and small towns drifted by like fading snapshots, reminders of a world that was comfortable and ordinary, a world they were leaving behind. Inside the train cars, men sat with duffel bags tucked against their legs, trading sandwiches or candy bars, writing last-minute letters, or simply staring at the countryside in silence. The journey could take days, sometimes stretching across the continent toward East Coast ports. At night, the train swayed with a rhythmic motion, and the men tried to sleep in their seats, leaning their heads against windows that vibrated with the hum of the rails. Conversations filled the hours. Talk of home, of girls waiting back in Ohio or Texas, of favorite baseball teams, of how long they thought the war might last. Someone might pull out a deck of cards, and soon there would be a circle of laughter and groans as poker chips or loose coins changed hands. Yet underneath all of it was the tension of what lay ahead. Arriving at the port was a moment none of them forgot. Rows of gray-painted ships lined the docks, each bristling with lifeboats, ropes, and gun mounts. The air smelled of salt and diesel fuel, and the cries of seagulls mixed with the shouts of officers trying to organize hundreds of men at once. Boarding the troopship was like stepping into a floating city. Narrow passageways wound deep into the vessel, lined with bunks stacked 3 or even 4 high, each nothing more than a thin mattress and a blanket. Privacy vanished, replaced by the constant closeness of other bodies, the scent of sweat, tobacco, and damp clothing lingering everywhere. The voyage across the Atlantic was an ordeal in itself. Seasickness was common, especially in the first days when the ship pitched and rolled against waves. Meals were served in crowded mess halls where trays slid on the tables as the vessel rocked, and many men could barely swallow the watery soup or bread placed in front of them. To pass the time, some played cards, others wrote letters, though the letters could not be sent until the ship docked. Lectures were given on survival, on enemy tactics, on the importance of discipline. And always, in the background, was the fear of German U-boats lurking beneath the waves. At night, the ship traveled in zigzag patterns, changing course to make targeting harder, while lookouts scanned the dark horizon for any sign of a torpedo's wake. Despite the tension, there were moments of wonder. Standing on deck at sunrise, seeing nothing but the endless expanse of water glowing pink and gold, was unforgettable. The air carried a sharp chill, and the smell of salt clung to every surface. But the sight of the ocean stretching farther than the eye could see reminded men how vast the world truly was. Some whispered that it felt as though they had left not only their homeland but also the very boundaries of the familiar world behind. Eventually, land appeared again, usually the grey outline of England's coast. The ships docked at busy ports, and men filed off in endless columns, boots clattering on the gangplanks, duffel bags slung over their shoulders. England in wartime was unlike anything they had known. Streets were dim at night, covered in blackout curtains to prevent enemy bombers from finding their targets. Buildings bore scars of previous raids, with broken windows patched by wood and brick walls left jagged from explosions. Yet life carried on. British civilians walked briskly, carrying baskets of rations, children played in alleys, and women in scarves and uniforms smiled politely at the foreign soldiers. American pilots were assigned to air bases scattered across the countryside. These bases were often constructed quickly, with long runways cutting across fields that had once grown wheat or barley. Wooden huts or Nissen huts with curved metal roofs served as barracks. Inside, the rooms were crowded but functional, with potbelly stoves in the middle that smoked heavily when the wind shifted. The beds were narrow, and the air was damp, but it became home. The first days were filled with orientation. Pilots were briefed on the enemy, shown maps of German-occupied Europe, taught radio procedures, and instructed in the strict rules of formation flying. They were introduced to the planes they would soon command in combat, towering bombers with crews of 10, or sleek fighters meant for speed and agility. There was excitement, yes, but also apprehension. A man could climb into the cockpit of a P-51 and admire its polished metal, but he knew that the beauty of the machine was designed for war. Life on base had its rhythms. Breakfast was usually served early, powdered eggs again, toast, sometimes porridge, with mugs of tea provided by British cooks. The tea was stronger than many Americans were used to, but eventually they grew to crave it, especially in the damp English mornings. Training flights filled the days, engines roaring as planes lifted off in staggered intervals, climbing into gray skies that seemed constantly heavy with clouds. Landing was often difficult, as crosswinds swept across the runways, and more than one plane came down too hard, wheels skidding until it lurched to a halt with sparks flying. Evenings offered a chance to breathe. Pilots might ride bicycles into nearby villages, where pubs welcomed them with pints of warm ale and the sound of music from battered pianos. The British locals were curious about the Americans, calling them Yanks, teasing them about their accents, but also treating them with warmth. Sometimes dances were organized in town halls, with uniforms pressed as best as possible and shoes polished until they gleamed. In those moments, the war seemed distant, replaced by laughter, the shuffle of feet on wooden floors, and the simple joy of human connection. But the war was never truly far away. The drone of enemy bombers could sometimes be heard overhead, and the distant thud of anti-aircraft guns echoed across the countryside. News from the front reached the bases daily, and losses were counted with grim faces. Each pilot knew his turn would come soon. The reality of combat loomed closer with every briefing, every practice mission, every glance at the sky. It was a strange existence, half ordinary, half extraordinary. The men lived between two worlds. The world of tea and dances, of bicycle rides through quiet English lanes lined with hedges, and the world of roaring engines, flak bursts, and the knowledge that one mistake at 20,000 feet could end everything. For the American pilots, the balance between these worlds was fragile, and it was in that tension that their story truly unfolded. The first time a pilot was assigned to an actual combat mission, the atmosphere in the barracks changed completely. Laughter grew quieter, conversations shorter, and even the most confident men found themselves staring at the floor or fidgeting with their gear. The night before, some tried to sleep, but the thought of what was coming kept them awake, staring at the rafters of the hut while the wind rattled the tin roof. Others sat at wooden tables under dim lamps, writing one more letter home, folding it neatly, and leaving it on their bunk in case they did not return. The morning of the mission began before dawn. The sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed across the base as men filed toward the briefing hall, their breath visible in the cold air. Inside, the room buzzed with low voices until the operations officer entered, pointing to the large map at the front. Red strings stretched across the board, showing the route they would take into enemy territory, the target they were assigned to destroy, and the expected flak zones. The officer spoke steadily, listing altitudes, speeds, rendezvous points, and radio codes. To the pilots, the words blurred together, but each man understood the unspoken truth. Some of them would not be coming back. After the briefing came the ritual of preparation. Flight suits were pulled on, heavy boots laced tight, leather jackets zipped against the morning chill. Parachutes were strapped to their backs, oxygen masks checked, and sidearms holstered at their belts. Crew members joked with one another in forced voices, trying to keep spirits high. A bombardier might quip about hoping the Germans were still asleep, or a gunner might grin and say he intended to shoot down an entire squadron by himself. But the nervous glances betrayed them. Walking out onto the runway was unforgettable. The planes loomed in the gray light like massive beasts waiting to be awakened. Bombers sat lined up in rows, their propellers slowly turning as ground crews made final adjustments. The scent of fuel and oil filled the air, mixing with the sharp cold of the morning. Pilots climbed into cockpits, sliding into seats that felt suddenly too small, while gunners crawled into their turrets, checking ammunition belts with trembling hands. Engines roared to life one by one, the ground shaking as the air vibrated with power. Takeoff was always tense. The bombers rolled down the runway, lifting into the sky heavy with fuel and explosives. Fighters followed, their smaller frames darting upward with grace, circling to join formation. Soon, dozens of planes filled the sky, wings glittering with frost as they climbed higher and higher. From the ground, villagers sometimes stopped to watch, gazing upward as the endless stream of aircraft disappeared into the distance. For those villagers, it was both inspiring and frightening. They knew these men were flying into danger, and many would not return. Crossing the English Channel, the chatter on the radios grew tense. Pilots adjusted their goggles, tightened their grips on the controls, and scanned the horizon. Every shadow in the clouds seemed suspicious. Every glint of sunlight might be the reflection of an enemy plane. The closer they drew to occupied Europe, the more their senses sharpened. Hearts raced, but hands had to remain steady. The lives of the entire crew depended on calm precision. And then came the flak. At first it appeared as distant puffs of black smoke in the sky, but soon the explosions grew louder, shaking the aircraft as shrapnel clattered against metal fuselages. The sound was deafening, a hammering roar that seemed to fill every corner of the plane. Pilots gritted their teeth, keeping formation even as the sky turned into a storm of fire and steel. Some planes burst into flames, spiraling downward in trails of smoke, while others pressed on, determined to reach the target. The target itself might be a factory, a rail yard, or a supply depot. The bombers leveled out as bombardiers took control, peering through their sights, adjusting dials with painstaking care despite the chaos outside. Bombs away, came the call, and suddenly the weight lifted from the aircraft as the bombs fell, tumbling silently before detonating far below. The shockwaves rippled upward, visible even at altitude, while smoke and fire spread across the ground. But the danger was not over. Enemy fighters soon appeared, streaking out of the clouds with blazing guns. German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs dove at the bombers, their tracers slicing through the air. Gunners shouted as they swung their turrets, unleashing streams of bullets. The sky became a deadly dance, planes weaving and twisting, some colliding in bursts of fire. Pilots and the fighters darted among the chaos, climbing, diving, rolling, straining their bodies against the crushing force of G-forces. In those moments, everything narrowed to survival. The pilots' hands were slick with sweat on the controls, the sound of engines roaring louder than thought itself. Time seemed to stretch, seconds turning into hours as every movement meant the difference between life and death. A glance to the left might show a friend's plane in flames, while a glance to the right revealed another enemy streaking past. There was no room for hesitation, no pause for reflection, only instinct, training, and determination. When the order came to turn back, relief mixed with exhaustion. The formations reassembled as best they could, limping toward the coast with engines coughing, wings riddled with holes, and nerves frayed to the breaking point. Crossing the channel again felt like crossing into safety, though they knew the mission would be judged not by who survived, but by whether the target had been destroyed. Landing was chaotic. Some planes came in with wheels barely functioning, others slid across the runways with sparks flying. Ambulances waited at the edge of the field, ready to rush forward for the wounded. Crews staggered out of their planes, their faces pale, uniforms soaked with sweat despite the cold. Some lit cigarettes immediately, hands shaking as they tried to process what had just happened. Others sat in silence, staring at the ground, their minds still somewhere in the skies above Europe. Debriefings followed quickly. Officers asked questions, noting details about enemy tactics, flak positions, and mechanical failures. Pilots answered mechanically, their voices flat, as if speaking of another world. And then, after the reports were filed, they returned to their barracks, to the narrow bunks and the potbelly stoves, where they tried to rest before the next mission. The strange thing was how quickly it became routine. What was at first overwhelming soon became a pattern: briefings, flights, combat, debriefings, exhaustion. Life was measured not in days or weeks, but in missions completed. Each tally marked survival, but also a reminder of how many friends had not returned. And yet, between the terror of the skies and the quiet of the nights, life continued, with its small comforts, its moments of laughter, and its unspoken hope that maybe, just maybe, they would live to see the end of it all. After the adrenaline of the missions, there was a peculiar quiet that settled over the base, a kind of fragile calm that existed only until the next alarm sounded. The pilots learned quickly that surviving in the air was only half the challenge. Surviving the monotony and the tension of the ground was equally crucial. Days blended together, measured by the rising and setting sun, by the smell of engine oil, and by the rhythm of routine tasks that never seemed to end. Washing planes, polishing propellers, checking instruments, maintaining radios. All of these became rituals, exercises that seemed trivial, yet they were vital. Any oversight could cost lives. Meals were a curious blend of the mundane and the comforting. The English cooks tried to accommodate the American taste buds, though success was limited. Breakfasts often featured boiled eggs and bread, washed down with tea, while lunches might include a stew of meat and root vegetables, sometimes enhanced by the occasional canned fruit. Dinner could bring a welcome variety: a roast, potatoes, or sometimes the elusive pie that traveled from town to base by hand, carried by a local who knew the pilot's longing for something sweet. Yet, despite the simplicity, every meal was a reprieve. A chance to eat in the company of friends, to share stories, to laugh softly at the absurdities of life in wartime England. Evenings were the true refuge. Some pilots rode bicycles through the narrow lanes to nearby villages, where pubs offered warmth, laughter, and music. Others lingered on base, leaning against the cool metal of the planes, smoking cigarettes, and talking quietly about home, about what they missed, about what they hoped to see when the war ended. A guitar might appear in the barracks, and soon soft chords accompanied murmured singing. The melodies were simple, familiar tunes from back home, but the sound of music against the backdrop of the war created a strange and poignant contrast, as though they were reclaiming a piece of normalcy for themselves. Friendship became a lifeline. Men who had arrived as strangers grew inseparable quickly. They learned each other's habits, preferences, and fears. One pilot might always carry a lucky charm in his pocket. Another might whistle while he worked. And soon these quirks became markers of identity and reassurance. When a plane returned from a mission, the crew would often hug, slap backs, or exchange brief jokes to dispel the tension, even as their minds remained aware of the risks that would come again. Rumors traveled fast. As well, stories of miraculous escapes, daring maneuvers, or enemy pilots who had vanished mid-flight. Some were true, others embellished over cups of tea and tired laughter, yet all contributed to the mythology of being in the skies. Letters were another vital thread. Pilots wrote home with meticulous care, describing the mundane alongside the extraordinary. They painted scenes of English villages, the food they missed, the songs they sang, and sometimes the terrifying experiences of combat, though usually in a coded or softened way to protect loved ones from worry. Receiving letters in return was a balm. Each envelope was a reminder of life beyond the airfields, of family and friends waiting in a world untouched by flak bursts and roaring engines. Some letters contained pressed flowers or newspaper clippings, small tokens of the ordinary life that they craved. Sleep was both elusive and treasured. After long missions, the body demanded rest, yet the mind often refused to comply. Dreams were haunted by the roar of engines and flashes of explosions, sometimes merging with memories of home into vivid, surreal landscapes. Pilots learned to find calm in routine, polishing boots, checking instruments, or sitting quietly by a stove as night fell over the base. Some turned to small rituals, counting the rivets on their plane's wings, sketching airplanes or maps, humming songs under their breath. These acts, seemingly insignificant, anchored them in a world that made sense, a world where they could control something even if only for a moment. Recreation could be inventive. When the weather allowed, softball games broke out in fields adjacent to the runways. Pilots and ground crews competed, cheering and jeering, letting the physical exertion release tension. Some crafted small hobbies, model airplanes built from scraps, sketches of planes and landscapes, even playing chess or cards late into the night. And always, there were the stories told quietly among friends. Tales of close calls, improbable survival, or mischievous pranks that had been pulled at another base. Laughter in these moments was both defiance and relief, a reminder that life could still exist even under the constant shadow of war. Rumors, too, were a form of entertainment and information. Whispers of new enemy aircraft designs, tales of daring raids over distant cities, or the supposed exploits of the ace pilots in their own squadrons circulated rapidly. Some stories were exaggerated, others deliberately false, meant to test nerves or provoke camaraderie, but all fed into a collective imagination that blended fear, admiration, and excitement. A man might quietly wonder if the tale of a bomber returning with half its wings missing was true, and whether he would be lucky or skilled enough to survive if he ever faced the same situation. Daily life on the base was a balance of work and small joys. Maintenance, flight checks, briefings, and drills consumed hours, but the men found pockets of respite in simple pleasures. A cup of strong tea, a warm blanket, the sound of a friend laughing at a silly joke, or a quiet moment watching the sun set behind the rolling hills. Every moment of comfort was amplified because it was so fleeting, because at any second a mission could call them back into the sky, back into the roar of engines and the white-hot terror of flak and tracer fire. And yet, despite the ever-present danger, there was a rhythm to it. Life became a series of cycles. Preparation, anticipation, execution, return, rest, and small joys. In this rhythm, pilots discovered resilience. They laughed, argued, worried, celebrated, and mourned together. They became experts at inhabiting two worlds at once: the intense immediacy of combat and the fragile, tender reality of life on the ground. Between the fear and the mundane, between the engines and the songs, they crafted a life that was vivid, exhausting, terrifying, and yet astonishingly human. There was a quiet that fell over the barracks after a particularly grueling mission, one that left men with hands trembling from tension and bodies stiff from hours in cramped cockpits. In those moments, The mind wandered in ways that were both necessary and terrifying. Pilots thought about home, about mothers who had kissed them goodbye, fathers who had patted their shoulders with pride, sisters who teased them relentlessly, friends they had left behind. They wondered which of their companions would be on the next flight and which might not return. Fear was never absent, but it became a companion, a steady presence that sharpened their awareness and honed their reflexes. Some nights, when the base was quiet and the wind whispered through the metal roofs, a man would lie on his bunk staring at the ceiling, imagining the missions yet to come. Thoughts of flak bursting beneath the plane, of tracer bullets slicing through the air, and of the enemy fighters diving from clouds would rise unbidden. He would remember the faces of men he had watched fall from the sky, those who had laughed with him only days before, now gone forever. Sleep often came in fits and starts, each dream punctuated by the roar of engines or the sudden flash of imagined explosions. Yet in the same stretch of hours, pilots found courage they didn't know existed. The routines of preparation, checking instruments, inspecting wings, strapping into harnesses, became rituals that grounded them, providing a semblance of control in a world otherwise dominated by chaos. Small victories mattered. Successfully taking off in heavy rain, completing a training maneuver without error, even simply navigating across the English countryside without incident. These victories, no matter how minor, built confidence and resilience. Friendships deepened in these conditions. Men who had once been strangers became brothers in arms, sharing secrets and superstitions, teasing one another about quirks and habits, and finding humor even in dark times. A pilot might joke about the size of his parachute pack, while another complained about the smell of the leather jackets after a long day. Laughter in these moments was a kind of resistance, a refusal to let the war erase all traces of normal life. They celebrated birthdays quietly, shared small gifts found in town, and occasionally, when the officers were distracted, smuggled alcohol into the barracks for an evening of clandestine cheer. There were also small rituals of superstition. Pilots became convinced of lucky charms, routines before takeoff, or the need to touch a specific part of the cockpit for protection. Some carried coins, trinkets, or photos of loved ones. Others had intricate gestures, like tapping the wings twice before taxiing or whistling a particular tune. Whether these rituals actually affected outcomes was irrelevant. The act of performing them calmed nerves and created a sense of continuity in an unpredictable world. Training, even after they had seen combat, continued. Pilots flew practice missions, rehearsed formations, and refined maneuvers. Some days, drills were exercises in endurance, testing the limits of the aircraft and of the men themselves. Pilots practiced emergency landings in muddy fields, simulated dogfights, and calculated precise bombing runs on makeshift targets. The repetition was exhausting, yet it ingrained reflexes that could mean the difference between life and death. Every calculation, every adjustment, every careful glance at the altimeter mattered. Meals remained a mixture of sustenance and comfort. Bread and stew were commonplace, but local English vegetables, fresh eggs, or a rare treat like a slice of cake were deeply appreciated. Coffee and tea became more than beverages. They were rituals that punctuated the day, moments of pause in otherwise relentless schedules. Pilots shared these moments together, sometimes quietly, sometimes in conversation that ranged from childhood memories to speculation about what awaited them overseas. These shared moments cemented bonds and created a network of support that would prove essential. Letters continued to arrive and depart. Some carried news of promotions or awards, others of births or marriages back home. Each envelope was a lifeline, a reminder that a world beyond bombs and engines existed, though it might feel increasingly distant. Men read the letters aloud in small clusters, savoring each word, discussing the nuances of news from America, and occasionally debating the accuracy of reported events. It was a way to maintain a connection to life before war, a thread that anchored them amidst the turbulence. The psychological weight of combat lingered like a shadow. Some pilots found it difficult to eat or sleep, haunted by the faces of enemy planes, burning wrecks, or friends lost in midair. Others retreated into silent contemplation, staring at the sky or sketching planes and landscapes, attempting to impose order on memories that were inherently chaotic. Officers recognized this strain and tried to provide outlets, briefings, counseling sessions, or simply opportunities to rest. But no structured support could fully erase the imprint of experience, and men learned to rely on each other for reassurance, empathy, and occasional humor that cut through fear like sunlight. Entertainment also took many forms. Pilots would read novels or newspapers, play cards or dice, or engage in light-hearted competitions with their peers. Some wrote poetry, chronicling the emotions they could not voice in conversation. Occasionally, they experimented with photography, capturing images of their planes, the base, or the landscape beyond. These artifacts of daily life became a testament to the human desire to preserve normalcy, to mark existence even in a world dominated by war. At the same time, there was a constant awareness of mortality. Pilots measured time not only in days but in missions flown and sorties survived. Each flight carried a risk that could end abruptly, and men learned to accept uncertainty as a constant companion. This acceptance did not eliminate fear, but it tempered it, transforming anxiety into focus, hesitation into action, and panic into disciplined response. Courage, they realized, was often a product of routine, camaraderie, and preparation, rather than absence of fear. Through it all, life on the airbase continued with its delicate balance. There was work, there was rest, there were brief joys, and there were shadows of loss. Men laughed, argued, reflected, and endured together, inhabiting a world where survival was uncertain. Yet moments of human connection, small pleasures, and fleeting beauty created a fragile, sustaining rhythm. It was a world both ordinary and extraordinary, shaped by danger, friendship, and the unending pursuit of endurance, skill, and hope. As weeks turned into months, the novelty of foreign lands faded, replaced by a strange familiarity. Pilots began to navigate not only the skies but also the contours of daily life far from home. The villages near their bases became recognizable. The baker with flour-streaked hands, the blacksmith whose hammer rang at dawn, the small children waving timidly as Americans pedaled past on borrowed bicycles. Local pubs offered warmth, but also subtle lessons in foreign customs. The proper way to order ale, the etiquette of tipping, even the intricate way one might compliment a hostess without seeming intrusive. These small details, mundane in appearance, were comforting, a bridge to normalcy, a tether to humanity amidst the backdrop of war. Interactions with the British civilians were a mixture of camaraderie, curiosity, and sometimes gentle tension. Locals were curious about the Yanks, asking questions in their clipped accents, teasing about the American slang, or complimenting them for their bravery. Pilots learned to appreciate the small kindnesses. A hot meal passed through a back window, a friendly nod during morning exercises, or a newspaper slipped under the door containing stories of home, war, and the world beyond. The cultural exchange, subtle as it was, offered a sense of grounding, reminding men that they were not merely instruments of combat, but humans navigating a complex world. Meanwhile, the strain of repeated missions began to accumulate. Fatigue was a constant companion, creeping into muscles and thoughts alike. Eyes became sore from hours of scanning the horizon, hands stiff from gripping controls under stress, and minds frayed by the constant calculation of risk. Yet even in exhaustion, pilots learned to find rhythm in repetition. The steady hum of engines, the familiar feel of levers and dials, the precise coordination of crew members performing synchronized tasks. This rhythm, like a metronome, provided stability in a life where stability was scarce. Entertainment and diversion became strategies for survival. Men crafted games out of necessity. Makeshift target practice using scraps of wood, races on the open stretches of the airfield, or storytelling contests judged by laughter and applause. Music persisted as a refuge. Guitars, harmonicas, and occasionally a piano created evenings filled with soft chords that echoed through barracks, turning even damp, cold nights into moments of comfort. Pilots sang songs from home, adding verses that reflected their experiences, blending nostalgia with humor, a subtle act of defiance against the harshness of reality. Letters continued to serve as lifelines. Each envelope represented a thread, connecting them to a world untouched by flak, bullets, or Engine's roar. Some pilots received packages of chocolate, socks, or handwritten notes with pressed flowers, small gestures that reminded them that life beyond the airfield still existed. The letters were read aloud to groups in hushed excitement, debated for accuracy or sentiment, and sometimes carried quietly back to bunks where they were cherished, examined, and reread in solitude. Rumors became a form of both entertainment and strategy. Word of enemy innovations, daring raids, or heroic escapes circulated quickly, blending fact with embellishment. Pilots debated the likelihood of certain tales. A bomber that returned with half its fuselage missing, a pilot who allegedly shot down multiple fighters single-handedly, or reports of enemy morale crumbling under sustained attacks. These stories fed imagination, fueled cautious optimism, and reinforced the camaraderie that was essential for psychological endurance. The daily routines of base life persisted, but subtle adaptations emerged. Pilots developed personal rituals, double-checking every screw and bolt on the aircraft, sketching maps of air routes, or even quietly meditating before flights. Some kept diaries, documenting everything from weather patterns to casual observations of wildlife and the changing seasons, small acts that preserved their sense of agency and continuity. These rituals, often unnoticed by others, were crucial in managing anxiety and maintaining focus, even when missions loomed imminently. Meals continued to anchor the day, a steadying force in the whirlwind of war. The English cuisine, simple but hearty, became familiar. Meat pies, roasted vegetables, porridge, tea, and the occasional fruit. Pilots often joked about the differences from home, but eventually embraced the flavors as part of their reality. Sharing food was as much about nutrition as about community. Men sat together, recounting experiences, offering comfort, or simply enjoying a fleeting sense of peace. Training never ceased, even in the heart of active campaigns. Pilots practiced maneuvers, refined bombing accuracy, and conducted simulations of emergency landings. Every repetition reinforced skill and confidence, and yet it also reminded them of vulnerability. Engines could fail, wings could tear, and in combat, instinct and preparation were inseparable from survival. Pilots became increasingly aware of the fragility of life, each flight a negotiation between skill, caution, and chance. Sleep remained uneven. Nights were punctuated by dreams that merged the ordinary and the extraordinary. The face of a loved one blending with clouds of flak, a familiar village street transforming into an airfield under attack. Men learned to rest even while their minds remained vigilant, finding brief solace in routine, conversation, or small comforts like a cigarette or a warm cup of tea. These moments, though fleeting, offered recovery, allowing pilots to return to the air with clarity and focus. Despite the strain, humor persisted. Pilots found ways to lighten the mood. Playful bets on who could complete a maintenance task fastest, exaggerated stories of daring or folly, and friendly teasing about quirks and superstitions. Laughter, even subdued, was a form of survival, a reminder that beneath the uniforms, the missions, and the constant danger, they were human beings capable of joy, creativity, and resilience. Life on base was thus a delicate equilibrium. Combat training, survival, camaraderie, small pleasures, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. Each pilot navigated the interplay between fear and courage, monotony and excitement, isolation and connection. In this balance, men discovered their strength, their adaptability, and a profound awareness of life's fleeting beauty. Every day was a negotiation between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between survival and experience, shaping a generation whose stories would echo long after the engines had stilled and the skies had cleared. The first large-scale missions over continental Europe were unlike anything the pilots had experienced before. From the moment the engines roared to life, there was a tangible shift in atmosphere, a mixture of tension, focus, and unspoken anticipation that pulsed through every crew member. The air seemed heavier, as if the very sky itself held a weight of danger. Planes lined up on the runway like silent sentinels, propellers spinning in anxious rhythm, and men climbed into cockpits with the precision and ritual they had developed over months of preparation. The sense of routine provided a measure of comfort, but it was fragile, easily shattered by the reality that awaited them beyond the coast. Formation flying became more critical than ever. In the vast expanse above, every plane had to maintain position, each movement calculated, every glance at the wingmen a reassurance that they were not alone. Allied fighters circled overhead, small silhouettes against the gray sky, ready to intercept enemy aircraft that might appear at any moment. Communication crackled through radios, brief and precise, each call a thread connecting men across hundreds of miles of open air. The crews relied on this coordination, understanding that even a minor lapse could result in disaster. The first sight of occupied territory was always striking. Towns and cities stretched out below, streets lined with buildings both grand and battered, smoke rising in columns from recent bombings. The pilots had read about these places, memorized maps, and studied enemy installations, but nothing prepared them for the visual and emotional impact of seeing a foreign land under occupation. Factories bristled with smokestacks, rail yards sprawled like intricate webs, and the occasional river glimmered as though reflecting a calm the ground below did not possess. The contrast between serene landscapes and the machinery of war was disorienting, almost surreal. Then came the flak, appearing like puffs of black smoke in the sky, punctuated by the sudden, violent eruptions that shook planes and rattled nerves. The pilots had practiced evasive maneuvers countless times, but the reality was far more terrifying. Each explosion sent shrapnel clattering against fuselage, the sound reverberating through metal and bone alike. Crew members shouted to one another over the roar of engines, swapping terse instructions while simultaneously monitoring altimeters, fuel levels, and the position of enemy fighters. Every second was a delicate balance between control and chaos. Allied pilots played a crucial role. American crews often coordinated with British and other Allied airmen, sharing skies, strategies, and sometimes even brief, tense conversations mid-air. The presence of comrades, skilled and familiar, provided both reassurance and a stark reminder of the collective risk. Pilots would occasionally glance at a nearby fighter or bomber, silently acknowledging the shared understanding that they were bound together not only by training but by circumstance, by the mutual reliance that came with facing death above enemy territory. Losses came quickly, often without warning. The first plane shot down left an indelible mark. Pilots watched helplessly as a friend spiraled from the sky in flames, the thin line of smoke tracing a trajectory impossible to ignore. Some crews managed to parachute safely, others did not. The sound of sirens, the abrupt silence in the cockpit when a wingman failed to respond, and the raw, guttural reactions to witnessing death instilled a sobering awareness that luck was as vital as skill. Emotional resilience became as important as technical proficiency, and the pilots learned to compartmentalize grief in order to survive. Between missions, conversations in the mess hall turned quieter, more reflective. Men discussed the day's events, pointing out moments of narrow survival, praising exceptional maneuvers, and sometimes debating tactics. Humor persisted but was sharper, tinged with irony and an acute awareness of mortality. One pilot might joke about having dodged death by an inch, another about a gunner who had gone completely berserk at just the right moment. These stories were shared not merely for amusement but as a form of coping, a collective effort to process experiences that defied ordinary comprehension. Letters took on new gravity. Families wrote with concern, sometimes blissfully unaware of the precise dangers their sons faced, and pilots wrote back carefully, often sanitizing details to spare loved ones worry. Even so, the act of writing or reading a letter became a ritual, a touchstone in a world dominated by uncertainty. Envelopes were examined, reread, and sometimes pinned on walls or tucked into diaries, serving as tangible reminders that life existed beyond the flak, beyond the roar of engines, and beyond the smoke-filled skies of combat. Rest became a fragile commodity. The adrenaline of combat made sleep both necessary and elusive. Bunks offered warmth and minimal comfort, yet the mind remained alert, replaying maneuvers, imagining enemy tactics, and calculating contingencies. Some pilots found solace in small distractions, sketching planes and landscapes, humming tunes from home, or quietly observing the movements of birds and clouds outside the barracks windows. These acts of normalcy became crucial, offering psychological reprieve from the intensity of wartime existence. Meals, once routine, acquired new significance. A slice of bread, a piece of meat, or a cup of tea was more than nourishment. It was a brief anchor to life as it had been before the war. Pilots savored the smallest pleasures, sometimes exaggerating the flavors or textures in conversation, laughing at the contrast between what they had once considered mundane and what now felt precious. Community around the table reinforced bonds, creating a network of support that was as essential to survival as any skill learned in the air. Rumors and stories, now informed by experience, spread rapidly. Tales of enemy innovations, miraculous escapes, and the exploits of ace pilots circulated with a mixture of reverence and skepticism. These narratives became part of the mental framework for survival, providing models for behavior, cautionary examples, and sometimes a sense of hope that exceptional skill or courage could tip the balance in life or death scenarios. Pilots debated these stories late into the night, testing logic against rumor, all while understanding that the truth was often far stranger than fiction. Daily routines on the base settled into a rhythm that balanced the extraordinary and the ordinary. Maintenance checks, briefings, training flights, meals, rest, camaraderie, and moments of reflection. Each day was marked by small victories, successful navigation, precise bombing, survival against odds, interwoven with losses and reminders of mortality. Within this structure, pilots discovered resilience, adaptability, and a profound understanding of the delicate interplay between danger and human connection. As the months wore on, pilots began to notice the subtle rhythms of life in Europe, the way villages and towns operated under the constant shadow of war. Streets that seemed empty at first revealed hidden markets, clandestine cafes, and small gatherings of locals who had adapted to occupation in quiet, ingenious ways. Windows displayed bundles of herbs, lines of laundry, or hints of domestic activity that seemed insignificant but held a profound reassurance. Life continued despite the destruction and fear. Pilots would sometimes walk through these streets when leave allowed, observing, absorbing, and learning the peculiarities of a culture that was at once foreign and strangely comforting. Humor became a currency of survival. Pilots joked about the differences in cuisine, sometimes exaggerating the taste of English mystery meat or marveling at the resilience of local pastries that survived multiple days in the damp climate. They teased each other relentlessly, inventing competitions over who could fold a parachute fastest, polish boots to the shiniest possible reflection, or memorize the longest string of radio codes without error. The laughter was never careless. It was sharp, precise, a mechanism to carve a little joy from the unrelenting tension that marked every day. Some pilots developed peculiar habits to maintain focus. One might count the rivets along the wing of his plane before every flight. Another might tap a specific spot on the cockpit for good luck, while yet another meticulously cleaned his goggles until they were almost translucent. These rituals, strange to an observer, were vital mental tools, anchors in a sky that could shift from serene to lethal in an instant. Even in the most mundane acts of maintenance, there was a sense of control that countered the unpredictable nature of combat. Interaction with allied pilots deepened over time. Meetings in mess halls or during shared flights became opportunities for exchanging stories, techniques, and unspoken strategies. British pilots shared their knowledge of local terrain, French resistance contacts, and nuances in enemy aircraft, while Americans contributed their own tactical observations and innovations. Respect was mutual, but so too was the awareness of risk. Each discussion, each plan, carried the weight of potential consequences, and everyone understood that camaraderie was inseparable from vigilance. Small victories and minor humiliations alike were etched into memory. A perfectly executed bombing run became a topic of muted pride, while a narrowly avoided collision, a failed landing, or a mechanical hiccup became stories retold with exaggerated flair and ironic laughter. These moments, collected over weeks and months, created a shared history, a patchwork of triumphs and near misses that bound men together and subtly shaped their collective identity. Pilots observed the skies and the land with a careful eye. Weather patterns, the movement of clouds, and the play of sunlight across fields became more than scenery. They were clues, guides, and sometimes omens. Birds were watched closely. Their flight could indicate changes in wind or the approach of danger. The men learned to read the smallest details, developing a sixth sense that was part instinct, part careful observation. Even the smallest anomaly, a shadow, a ripple of smoke, a glint in the distance, could mean the difference between life and death, and so attentiveness became a constant habit. Rest periods were precious, filled with both necessity and fleeting indulgence. Pilots slept fitfully, often in shifts, their minds half engaged in planning or replaying previous flights. Others engaged in small hobbies, sketching planes, writing letters, reading novels or newspapers, playing cards or chess, or quietly observing life around them. These acts, though simple, created continuity, offering an anchor to sanity in a world where chaos could erupt at any moment. Even mundane tasks, cleaning boots, polishing metal, arranging personal items, became forms of meditation, rituals that steadied nerves and provided reassurance. Meals were still a vital anchor. Pilots often gathered in small groups, sharing the contents of mess tins, comparing notes on local flavors, and laughing at minor culinary disasters. Tea became almost sacred, poured with deliberate care, sometimes accompanied by a slice of bread or a biscuit. Conversation flowed easily in these moments, ranging from light-hearted banter to hushed reflections on missions past, or speculation about future sorties. These meals were more than nourishment. They were emotional sustenance, binding men together through shared experience. Letters continued to arrive sporadically, carrying news, encouragement, and sometimes confounding tidbits from home. Photographs, pressed flowers, or clippings from local papers were cherished for hours, sometimes days, as men studied each detail, imagining the lives of those who had sent them. Correspondence was a lifeline, a reminder that a world outside the base still existed, and that their sacrifices had meaning beyond the immediate demands of war. Some men read aloud in small gatherings, sharing news of birthdays, weddings, or the mundane events of daily life, creating a sense of connection and continuity. Rumors persisted, sometimes as cautionary tales, sometimes as inspiration. Stories of ace pilots, enemy innovations, or miraculous escapes circulated with rapidity, providing both amusement and subtle lessons. Pilots debated the veracity of these tales, learning to extract strategic insights while savoring the camaraderie that emerged from shared speculation. The blending of reality, embellishment, and imagination became an essential part of their mental armor, reinforcing resilience and sharpening instincts. Amidst it all, a subtle tension remained. Awareness of mortality, the knowledge that each flight could be the last, and the understanding that survival depended on skill, preparation, and a measure of luck. Pilots carried this knowledge with them, shaping their behavior, enhancing focus, and influencing even the smallest decisions. Yet within this tension, life flourished. Friendships deepened, laughter persisted, and moments of beauty. Sunset over a quiet village, the shimmer of frost on wings, a perfectly executed formation, offered fleeting relief and enduring memory. Every day, every mission, every mundane or extraordinary detail contributed to a tapestry of experience, one that bound the pilots to each other, to the land they traversed, and to the wider war effort. Their lives became an intricate dance between fear and courage, monotony and excitement, danger and fleeting pleasure. A life measured not merely in days, but in the countless small choices, rituals, and acts of resilience that made survival possible. The first real encounter with loss hit harder than any flak burst or enemy fighter. One morning, a plane failed to return from a routine bombing mission, and the absence was palpable before the news even arrived. Pilots searched the sky instinctively, expecting to see familiar silhouettes, only to realize with a chilling clarity that a friend was gone. The emotional impact was immediate and disorienting. Men who had shared jokes the night before now sat in silence, staring at the floors of barracks or out over the airfield, grappling with the reality that the war was not an abstract concept but a brutal, relentless force capable of erasing someone's existence in an instant. Letters and telegrams soon confirmed the worst. The lost pilot had been shot down over enemy territory, parachuting too late to survive, the wreckage witnessed by local resistance sympathizers. The group's reaction was complex. Grief mixed with guilt, relief that they themselves had returned safely, and a renewed, almost tangible, fear that the next mission could claim any of them. Officers encouraged them to compartmentalize, but the process was deeply personal and often chaotic. Some men retreated into solitude, others sought comfort in conversation, and some simply worked longer hours, immersing themselves in maintenance and preparation as a way to stave off emotional collapse. In the days that followed, small rituals became more important than ever. Pilots would polish every instrument, check every lever and gauge with obsessive precision, and touch Lucky Charms repeatedly before takeoff. These acts, while seemingly trivial, were psychologically vital. They created a semblance of control, a buffer against the randomness of fate. Some wrote letters to the families of lost comrades, offering condolences and recounting personal memories, both as a gesture of humanity and as a way to process their own grief. Even humor found its way into the barracks, often dark, ironic, or absurd, as men clung to levity to counterbalance sorrow. Sleep was elusive. After missions, men often lay awake for hours, replaying flights in their minds with relentless intensity. Small mistakes, near misses, or imagined scenarios haunted them. Dreams were vivid and sometimes violent, blending the mundane with the terrifying. One pilot described a recurring vision of flying over a familiar village only to see it transformed into a war zone, its streets filled with flames and smoke, while friends who had survived so far were caught in impossible, looping dangers. The line between dream and memory blurred, reinforcing the persistent tension that accompanied daily life. Coping mechanisms were essential. Pilots developed personal strategies to maintain mental balance. Some turned to writing, crafting detailed accounts of missions, observations, and thoughts. Others sketched maps, airplanes, and landscapes, a quiet exercise in control and reflection. Music remained a sanctuary. Soft strumming of guitars, the hum of harmonicas, or low singing in the barracks could temporarily dissolve the tension of the day. Even simple acts, like meticulously folding uniforms or polishing boots until they shone, were imbued with purpose and reassurance. Friendship, already vital, became a lifeline. Men shared not only routines and meals, but also the silent understanding of fear, loss, and survival. They discussed tactics, recounted stories of narrow escapes, and sometimes vented frustration through teasing and practical jokes. Laughter was not frivolous. It was deliberate, a shield against despair. Shared memories of home, family, or prior adventures reinforced bonds, reminding each pilot that beyond the planes, beyond flak and tracer fire, there existed a human connection strong enough to sustain them. Meals were quieter, more reflective. Bread, stew, tea, and occasional local delicacies became points of focus not merely for sustenance but for grounding the mind. Eating together was a ritual of reassurance, a subtle affirmation that life continued despite the chaos above. Pilots discussed small observations from village walks, amusing encounters with civilians, or oddities in English customs. These conversations, often humorous or trivial, reinforced normalcy and gave weight to the notion that the world was not entirely consumed by conflict. The base itself had become a landscape of memory and association. Certain trees, fences, or hangars triggered recollections of specific missions, near misses, or moments of camaraderie. Pilots navigated this environment with a heightened awareness, each corner and corridor infused with both mundane and extraordinary significance. The repetition of routines, maintenance checks, training drills, inspections became a psychological anchor, creating continuity in a world otherwise defined by unpredictability. Rumors, stories, and legends remained vital, providing both mental stimulation and tactical insight. Tales of enemy aircraft, remarkable escapes, and heroic feats circulated rapidly. Pilots debated the veracity of these stories, extracting lessons or inspiration as needed, while also enjoying the subtle thrill of shared speculation. This blend of fact, exaggeration, and imagination offered both cognitive engagement and emotional relief, a space to process fear indirectly. Amid the tension, moments of beauty emerged. Sunrise over a quiet village, frost on the airfield, birds gliding above the hangars. Small, fleeting, yet profoundly grounding. Pilots learned to notice these details, to hold on to them as reminders of life's fragile continuity. Humor, ritual, camaraderie, and attention to these simple wonders became intertwined with survival, shaping not only skill but resilience. Through loss, fear, and exhaustion, men discovered limits and strengths they had not known existed. They adapted, both mentally and physically, creating a delicate balance between vigilance and relaxation, duty and personal preservation. Each day, each mission, each moment of connection or levity contributed to a growing understanding. Survival required not only technical skill and courage, but also emotional intelligence, empathy, and the capacity to find meaning amidst chaos. Life at the airbase, hovering between danger and routine, was a paradox, simultaneously exhausting, terrifying, and profoundly human. Pilots learned that humor, ritual, friendship, and small pleasures were as essential as instruments, maps, and strategy. Through these elements, they crafted a fragile, enduring equilibrium, navigating the relentless tension of combat while preserving the threads of ordinary life that sustained them, reminding themselves, against all odds, that existence could persist even amidst war. The pace of the war accelerated, and with it, the tempo of missions became relentless. Days blurred into nights, flights stacked upon flights, each sortie a test of endurance and skill. Pilots awoke with the knowledge that their schedules were dictated not by sunrise or sunset, but by the strategic needs of the command, weather patterns, and intelligence reports. Fatigue settled into bones and minds, a persistent weight that could not be shaken, and yet the routines, the careful inspection of wings, the steady hum of engines, the synchronized checks with crew members, provided a framework, a structure that allowed survival amidst chaos. Interaction with ground troops added a new layer of awareness and responsibility. Pilots learned quickly that the men advancing below, exposed to artillery and machine guns, relied on aerial support for both morale and tactical advantage. Briefing rooms buzzed with maps, notes, and strategic overlays, and pilots studied these meticulously, understanding that every choice in the sky had consequences on the ground. Conversations with infantry, artillery units, and reconnaissance teams revealed the human dimension of war. Names, stories, fears, and hopes, each encounter deepening the sense that the sky and earth were intertwined in a delicate, perilous dance. Psychological strain intensified. Pilots who had once coped with fear through humor or ritual now faced moments when anxiety felt insurmountable. A single failed maneuver, a mechanical warning, or the sudden appearance of enemy aircraft could trigger physical reactions. Trembling hands, rapid heartbeat, or icy sweat. Some turned inward, isolating themselves to process emotions. Others leaned on friends, sharing fears in quiet corners or over the steaming cups of early morning tea. Officers recognized these pressures, offering guidance and monitoring signs of burnout, yet much of the coping remained personal, crafted through experience and adaptation. Routines became increasingly crucial, a shield against the unpredictability of missions. Pilots meticulously maintained their planes, checked fuel lines, tightened screws, and inspected every instrument with obsessive attention. The ritual was as much about mental reassurance as mechanical safety. The act of control in preparation provided a psychological buffer against the randomness of combat. Rituals also extended to personal habits. Tapping a specific spot on the cockpit, counting rivets, or folding flight manuals with careful precision. These acts, seemingly minor, were essential lifelines in an otherwise chaotic existence. Humor remained a cornerstone of endurance. Pilots discovered that exaggeration and absurdity could alleviate tension, even in the aftermath of intense sorties. Tales of improbable escapes, overzealous gunners, or comically misjudged maneuvers became shared narratives, told and retold to lighten spirits. Some stories were embellished with wild imaginings, others grounded in reality, but all served a single purpose: to remind men that, despite the ever-present danger, laughter remained possible. It was a fragile, necessary triumph over the omnipresent weight of mortality. Meals took on ritualistic importance. The simple act of sitting together, sharing bread, meat, or a rare slice of fruit became a grounding practice. Conversation often meandered from local oddities, such as a shopkeeper's eccentric routine or a village cat that had taken up residence in the barracks, to more profound reflections on home, family, and the stark realities of combat. Even small culinary mishaps, burnt potatoes or overcooked stew, were met with good-natured complaints, laughter, and subtle competition over who could make the most edible version. These moments, infused with humor and camaraderie, reminded men that life existed outside the cockpit and that ordinary pleasures could coexist with extraordinary danger. Letters continued to be treasured lifelines. Pilots read correspondence aloud in small groups, sharing news of marriages, births, or mundane domestic details, creating a connection to a world untouched by flak, tracer fire, and mechanical alarms. Photos, newspaper clippings, or small trinkets sent from home were carefully preserved, examined, and sometimes discussed in reflective, almost reverent tones. These tangible reminders of life beyond the base provided solace, a subtle anchor against the disorientation of extended campaigns. Training persisted alongside operational sorties. Even experienced pilots engaged in drills to refine maneuvers, simulate emergency procedures, and rehearse formation flying. These sessions, while exhausting, were necessary to maintain precision and cohesion under conditions of increasing fatigue. Pilots often competed lightly during these exercises, racing to complete maintenance checks or executing mock formations with exaggerated flair. These playful competitions, though seemingly trivial, reinforced teamwork, honed skills, and preserved morale under relentless pressure. The accumulation of missions and stress occasionally led to moments of vulnerability. A pilot might become unusually quiet, replaying a near miss or a tragic loss, while another might express frustration or irritability, snapping at minor inconveniences. Observing these reactions became part of the social intelligence of the group, as men learned to offer subtle support, shared humor, or silent understanding, knowing that emotional endurance was as critical as technical skill. The interplay of resilience, camaraderie, and personal coping strategies formed an intricate web that allowed men to continue functioning under extreme strain. Every flight, every interaction, every moment, mundane or extraordinary, was embedded with meaning. The sight of a familiar village, the distant glint of sunlight on a river, the precise turn of a propeller, the shared joke over a misfiring engine, all contributed to a sense of continuity and identity. Pilots internalized lessons of caution, vigilance, and empathy, while also cultivating humor, ritual, and attention to small details as defenses against the psychological toll of combat. The war shaped not only skills and tactics, but also the very structure of thought, emotion, and human connection. Through the relentless pace of missions, the interplay of danger, humor, and ritual, and the subtle but profound bonds of friendship, pilots carved a fragile balance between survival and humanity. Life was measured not merely in days or sorties, but in the countless small moments that stitched together a coherent existence. Laughter after a near miss, a warm cup of tea, a letter from home, or a carefully polished instrument. This balance allowed men to endure, adapt, and even occasionally find beauty amidst the unyielding demands of war. Weeks stretched into months, and the cumulative toll of continuous missions began to manifest in subtle, sometimes alarming ways. Fatigue seeped into bones and minds alike, a persistent weight that no sleep could entirely shake. Pilots began noticing that reflexes dulled, judgment wavered, and concentration required conscious effort. Small mistakes in routine inspections became more common, and even the sharpest, most meticulous men had to remind themselves to double-check every lever, gauge, and control surface. The cockpit, once a realm of precise action and confidence, became a crucible of mental strain, where every decision carried amplified weight. Some pilots began developing unusual habits to counteract the pressure. One meticulously cataloged every mission, recording not only technical details but also weather conditions, emotional states, and minor quirks observed among comrades. Another developed a ritual of speaking to their plane as though it were a living entity, whispering encouragement before takeoff or quiet apologies after turbulent encounters. Others adopted repetitive exercises, tapping controls, counting rivets, reciting memorized phrases, to impose a sense of structure on an unpredictable environment. These behaviors, while eccentric, were essential coping mechanisms, a way to reclaim agency in a reality dictated by chaos and risk. Humor remained a crucial survival tool, often emerging in the strangest moments. A pilot might joke about narrowly avoiding a collision with a flock of birds, or invent exaggerated tales of enemy incompetence, transforming anxiety into laughter. Mess halls became theaters of improvisation, where men dramatized events of the day, creating a shared narrative that was part catharsis, part entertainment. Dark humor persisted, a delicate thread connecting men who knew that survival was as much about mental resilience as it was about skill or luck. Jokes about missing socks, burned meals, or absurd superstitions became daily rituals, small victories against despair. Interaction with local populations deepened, revealing both the subtle humanity and the stark realities of occupied territories. Pilots learned to navigate cultural nuances, sometimes with difficulty. A nod, a handshake, a polite refusal could carry layers of meaning, and missteps were avoided through observation and subtle questioning. Markets offered fleeting moments of normalcy, fresh bread, seasonal fruits, and small handmade items, but also reminders of scarcity and adaptation. Pilots observed the ingenuity of civilians, makeshift repairs to buildings, clever storage of food, or the discreet sharing of news forbidden by occupying forces. These glimpses of resilience inspired both admiration and humility, reinforcing the sense that life persisted even under duress. Losses, still frequent, now carried a deeper psychological weight. The absence of comrades created voids in the social fabric of the unit, and every mission was accompanied by an acute awareness that another friend might not return. Pilots responded differently. Some became withdrawn, replaying flights in isolation. Others sought constant engagement, maintaining a rapid pace of work to stave off intrusive thoughts. Officers attempted to monitor mental states, but much of the coping remained personal, woven into humor, ritual, and small, deliberate acts of normalcy. Sleep became a battleground. Even when the body rested, the mind often remained hyperactive, replaying near misses, calculating probabilities, or imagining worst-case scenarios. Dreams were vivid, sometimes violent, sometimes absurdly mundane. A favorite childhood street transformed into a war-torn battlefield. A morning meal in the mess hall interrupted by imaginary enemy planes. Pilots learned to extract fragments of comfort from these dreams, or at least to endure them, recognizing that rest, even fitful and incomplete, was essential for the next sortie. Meals, though repetitive, retained significance. Tea and bread, stew and preserved meats, occasional treats smuggled from local markets. These were more than nourishment. They were rituals reinforcing stability and connection. Pilots often discussed mundane observations, oddities in English customs, peculiar phrases, or amusing local behaviors, while savoring both sustenance and a temporary reprieve from the pressures above. Humor, conversation, and minor culinary indulgences became intertwined with survival, each bite and word a reminder of life beyond immediate danger. Allied coordination continued to be critical. Joint missions required meticulous planning and seamless execution, but also cultivated friendships and mutual respect. British, Canadian, and American pilots learned to anticipate one another's behaviors in the air, shared tips on navigation, and occasionally exchanged playful bets on performance. These interactions, grounded in both professionalism and camaraderie, reinforced a sense of shared purpose, while also offering moments of levity in an otherwise unrelenting environment. Rumors and stories remained a vital part of psychological survival. Tales of miraculous escapes, audacious maneuvers, or enemy failures circulated rapidly, providing lessons, entertainment, and a subtle boost to morale. Pilots debated their accuracy, incorporated observations into strategy, or simply enjoyed the shared narrative as a mental diversion. The stories, blending fact, exaggeration, and imagination, became a thread linking men across time, distance, and experience, reinforcing cohesion and resilience. The tension between extraordinary danger and ordinary existence became more pronounced. Pilots observed minute details with heightened awareness. The flicker of sunlight on an engine, the subtle shift of wind, a bird's flight pattern over a field. These observations were both practical, potentially life-saving, and symbolic, reminders that beauty and fragility persisted even amid devastation. Rituals, humor, letters, meals, and friendships all intertwined to create a fragile yet enduring balance, a psychological scaffolding that allowed men to navigate the relentless pressures of aerial warfare. Through fatigue, stress, and the ever-present threat of loss, pilots cultivated resilience, finding equilibrium in routines, camaraderie, and moments of levity. Every sortie, every observation, every laugh, and every small act of personal ritual contributed to a web of survival, intertwining skill, courage, and emotional intelligence. In the skies above Europe, amid the roar of engines, the flash of flak, and the shadows of enemy fighters, pilots discovered that endurance was as much a matter of the mind as it was of the body, and that humanity, laughter, reflection, and connection, was a powerful tool against the chaos of war. The first major air battles over continental Europe left an indelible mark on every pilot who participated, altering both perception and psyche. The sky, once a place of relative openness and controlled maneuvering, became a battlefield of unpredictable vectors, sudden attacks, and split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Formation flying demanded perfection. Any lapse could expose a pilot to enemy fire. Yet within this deadly choreography, there were moments of near poetry. The sweep of wings in coordinated turns, the glint of sunlight on aluminum fuselage, the distant patterns of flak exploding like dark flowers across the horizon. These glimpses of beauty were fleeting, but they lingered in memory, a counterpoint to the constant threat of destruction. Combat was intensely visceral. The roar of engines, the rattle of machine guns, the sudden eruption of anti-aircraft fire, all merged into a sensory overload that tested endurance and focus. Pilots learned to trust instinct as much as training, reacting to flashes, movements, and sounds almost before fully processing them. Each maneuver was precise yet adaptive. A dive, a barrel roll, or a sudden climb had to be executed with both speed and calculation, balancing aggression with caution. Moments of hesitation could prove fatal, yet hesitation itself was an inevitability when the mind raced to process multiple threats simultaneously. Heroic acts emerged organically, often unplanned. One pilot, realizing his wingman's plane was crippled, broke formation to guide him toward friendly territory, exposing himself to enemy fire. Another executed an improvised maneuver to protect a bomber from approaching fighters, narrowly avoiding a collision while forcing the attackers into a disadvantageous position. These moments were celebrated quietly, sometimes with laughter at the absurdity of survival, sometimes with subdued pride, never fully dramatized but etched into the collective memory of the unit. Heroism in these skies was as much about quick thinking and mutual support as it was about courage under fire. Extreme conditions tested both equipment and body. Cold winds at high altitude sapped energy, frost forming on visors and wings, while thin air challenged respiration and concentration. Pilots developed layered clothing systems, gloves, and scarves to maintain dexterity, while adjusting their schedules and altitude to optimize performance. Physical discomfort compounded mental strain, reinforcing the relentless nature of each sortie. Yet within these challenges, men discovered adaptive solutions, creative problem-solving, and the occasional triumph of ingenuity over circumstance. Humor persisted as a crucial coping mechanism, emerging spontaneously even in the thickest tension. A plane veered unexpectedly, narrowly avoiding collision, prompting exaggerated reenactments back at base. Miscommunications over radio channels inspired playful mockery and imitation, and absurd superstitions, lucky charms, rituals, and whispered incantations were performed with both sincerity and ironic acknowledgement. Laughter, even when tinged with fear, became a lifeline, binding pilots together and allowing moments of relief in a relentlessly high-stakes environment. Interactions with Allied pilots and ground forces were enriched by shared experience. British, Canadian, and American airmen exchanged tactics, offered assistance, and often joked about the quirks of each national approach to strategy and discipline. Ground troops provided essential intelligence, pointing out enemy positions or suggesting safe corridors, while pilots offered reconnaissance observations that informed the planning of larger operations. These exchanges, a blend of practical necessity and camaraderie, reinforced a sense of collective purpose and underscored the interdependence of air and ground forces. Meals, brief but vital, were infused with ritual and subtle social significance. Stew, preserved meats, tea, and occasional fresh produce were consumed with attention and appreciation, often accompanied by commentary on local customs or humorous observations about the day's sorties. These moments reinforced normalcy, reminding men that life extended beyond immediate danger and that small pleasures were essential to sustaining morale and mental clarity. Pilots traded stories of near misses, strange weather phenomena, or peculiar behaviors of local civilians, creating a tapestry of narrative that combined fact, exaggeration, and subtle exaggeration into communal memory. Letters remained treasured anchors, with correspondence read aloud or shared in small groups. Updates from home, marriages, births, small victories, or even trivial complaints provided a grounding perspective, a reminder of a world beyond combat. Photographs, pressed flowers, and keepsakes were examined carefully, often inspiring conversation, reflection, or quiet solace. These tangible links to ordinary life offered emotional sustenance and reinforced the continuity of existence outside the immediate sphere of danger. Pilots continued to refine personal rituals, small habits that provided psychological stability. Counting rivets, polishing instruments, reciting memorized phrases, or performing simple gestures before takeoff became essential acts of control. These rituals, seemingly trivial to an outsider, were deeply integrated into mental preparation, allowing men to navigate extreme stress and maintain focus during extended periods of uncertainty. Amid the chaos, beauty persisted. Clouds sculpted by wind, the shimmer of frost on wings, the delicate flight of birds over fields, or a sudden rainbow after rain were noticed, remembered, and cherished. Such moments, fleeting yet profound, provided psychological relief, a reminder that life and wonder could persist even amidst violence and exhaustion. The juxtaposition of fear, heroism, humor, and aesthetic appreciation became central to endurance, shaping not only the skills but the very mindset of each pilot. Through relentless campaigns, extreme conditions, heroic and absurd moments, and the delicate interplay of risk, humor, ritual, and camaraderie, pilots cultivated resilience that was as emotional and cognitive as it was physical. Life in the skies was a continuous negotiation between danger and ordinary existence, where survival depended not merely on skill or luck, but on the subtle network of human connection, observation, and mental discipline. Each sortie, each interaction, each laugh, and each ritual reinforced the fragile but enduring framework that allowed men to endure, adapt, and persist in a world defined by extraordinary demands and fleeting reprieves. The intensity of campaigns continued to escalate, and with it came the strange rhythm of adaptation. Pilots now moved through a world where danger, routine, and unexpected absurdity intertwined seamlessly. Airfields, once simple stretches of concrete and grass, transformed into bustling, chaotic ecosystems, where planes of every type, American, British, occasionally captured enemy craft, lined runways, engines idled in anticipation, and mechanics moved like choreographed shadows, repairing, adjusting, improvising. The presence of trophies, captured or salvaged enemy planes, added both fascination and subtle tension. Pilots would circle them during walks, inspecting unfamiliar construction, exchanging whispered theories on vulnerabilities, or quietly speculating about the technology that had enabled such formidable opponents. These encounters created a blend of curiosity, respect, and strategic analysis, offering both a mental challenge and a diversion from the routine. Life on base was an amalgam of fatigue, habit, and small triumphs. Pilots found themselves constantly negotiating the boundary between alertness and exhaustion. Sleep was increasingly fragmented, sometimes stolen in 20-minute bursts between missions or in the back of a crowded mess hall. The human body, pushed to its limits by altitude, cold, and adrenaline, adapted in unpredictable ways. Men developed peculiar microhabits, chewing gum during takeoff, tapping instruments in rhythm with the engine, humming muted melodies to calm nerves. These tiny rituals were not merely idiosyncratic. They became necessary scaffolds for concentration and mental stability, grounding pilots amid relentless physical and psychological demands. Humor persisted, often in subtle or absurd forms. A pilot might narrate a mission in exaggerated detail, assigning comically improbable motivations to enemy pilots, or reenact a precarious landing using exaggerated gestures in front of bemused comrades. Such episodes were never frivolous. They were tactical in a psychological sense, diffusing tension, reinforcing social cohesion, and creating a shared narrative where fear and survival could coexist with levity. Even minor mishaps, slipping on icy tarmac, dropping a tool, or misidentifying a local animal, became fodder for collective amusement, allowing men to laugh at vulnerability without diminishing vigilance. Meals remained central, both nutritionally and socially. Stew, bread, canned meats, and occasionally fresh items acquired from sympathetic locals were consumed with attention, conversation, and quiet reflection. Pilots shared observations of the local environment, odd customs, unusual weather, or peculiar civilian behaviors, and linked these discussions to broader considerations. How terrain affected sorties, where enemies might hide, or which routes minimized risk. The interweaving of practical intelligence and casual observation reinforced both camaraderie and operational effectiveness, transforming mundane moments into subtle strategies of survival. Letters continued to anchor minds to home. Each arrival sparked excitement, a ritual of careful inspection and shared reading. Photographs, small trinkets, and pressed flowers carried stories of ordinary life far removed from flak and tracer fire. These items were handled with reverence, often prompting storytelling, reflection, and emotional release. Pilots discussed contents with careful attention, extracting lessons, recalling memories, or simply savoring the continuity they represented. The exchange of personal history, even in brief, mundane forms, preserved connection and nurtured resilience. Missions remained technically demanding and emotionally draining. The interplay of aircraft formations, enemy engagements, and environmental conditions required constant adjustment. A single miscalculation, overestimating wind speed, underestimating cloud cover, misjudging distance, could result in catastrophic consequences. Pilots developed an acute observational sense, attuning to subtle cues. The reflection of sunlight on a wing, the direction of smoke on distant fields, the behavior of birds in the sky. Each small detail, integrated into instinct and analysis, became a critical component of both survival and tactical advantage. Interactions with Allied forces continued to shape perspective. British, Canadian, and other American units operated in close proximity, exchanging tactical insights, discussing performance quirks, and sometimes engaging in competitive banter. Ground forces provided ongoing intelligence, guidance, and moral support, highlighting the interdependence of sky and earth. These networks reinforced a sense of purpose and underscored the reality that no pilot acted in isolation. Each flight, each maneuver, each small success or error influenced a larger web of operations and lives. The accumulation of missions and fatigue led to subtle psychological shifts. Pilots found themselves contemplating mortality more frequently, reflecting on the fragility of life, and reconsidering priorities and values. Daily routines, humor, and small rituals became more than survival tools. They were methods of asserting agency in a universe largely beyond control. Moments of beauty, sunrise illuminating a valley, frost on a wing, a bird's sudden flight, provided perspective and a quiet reassurance, reinforcing the awareness that life persisted even amid chaos and destruction. Trophies, both material and symbolic, became points of reflection. Captured enemy aircraft, recovered equipment, or successful missions were not merely functional victories. They served as markers of skill, luck, and endurance. Pilots noted technical details, analyzed strengths and weaknesses, and integrated observations into broader strategic thinking. The presence of such objects reminded men of the adversary's ingenuity, the constant need for vigilance, and the tangible evidence of survival and accomplishment in a world otherwise dominated by unpredictability. Through the blend of extreme conditions, routine, humor, ritual, observation, and reflection, pilots continued to navigate the complex landscape of aerial warfare. Each sortie, each small victory, each interaction, whether mundane or extraordinary, wove a tapestry of experience that balanced skill, endurance, and humanity. The war was relentless, but within the chaos, pilots discovered strategies for resilience. Attention to detail, the cultivation of camaraderie, the deliberate use of humor, and a mindful observation of the world around them. These tools, small yet profound, became essential for navigating the physical and emotional demands of combat, preserving life, and maintaining a sense of identity amidst the pressures of sustained conflict. By now, the relentless pace of operations had woven itself into every aspect of life at the base. Pilots awoke before dawn, often before the sun had risen, moving through the cold mist to inspect aircraft, check instruments, and ensure fuel lines and ammunition were ready. The physical demands were matched only by the mental ones. Decision-making was constant, and every flight carried the weight of consequence. Yet, amid the rigor, the human element remained vivid. The camaraderie of shared early morning coffee, the muffled laughter over a minor mishap during inspection, or the whispered banter while adjusting straps and harnesses. These fleeting moments of normalcy became essential markers of stability, tiny oases of familiarity in a landscape dominated by unpredictability. Extreme conditions defined each sortie. Pilots contended with turbulent winds, sudden storms, icing at high altitude, and the ever-present threat of mechanical failure. Engines sometimes stuttered at the worst possible moments, instruments froze, and visibility could vanish in seconds, forcing pilots to rely on instinct honed through repetition and experience. These conditions tested both skill and nerves. One pilot recalled a mission in which a sudden downdraft nearly sent his plane into a valley wall. He recovered only after a combination of rapid calculations and a near-intuitive feel for the aircraft's responses. The adrenaline surged, leaving hands trembling long after the plane had touched down, while humor, sometimes grim, emerged as a necessary outlet. "I nearly kissed the hillside," he joked later, prompting laughter that was at once relieved and incredulous. Unexpected incidents became woven into daily experience. Birds occasionally collided with wings, engine alarms sounded erroneously, and navigation instruments sometimes misbehaved, creating minor crises that demanded immediate attention. One pilot recounted how a loose tool during takeoff had rolled under a pedal, forcing an improvised adjustment mid-flight. The story, recounted with exaggeration and theatrical gestures, became a legend within the squadron. These stories, part humor, part warning, reinforced both vigilance and the social bonds among pilots. They highlighted the thin line between disaster and survival, the constant improvisation required, and the human capacity to adapt creatively under stress. Fatigue accumulated, subtle at first, then unmistakable. Pilots noticed dulled reflexes, lapses in attention, and an almost constant background of mental tension. Sleep became more elusive, interrupted by dreams of flak bursts, engine failures, or friendly planes in peril. In these moments, memory, imagination, and anxiety intertwined, blurring the distinction between past events, current experiences, and imagined threats. Pilots developed microstrategies to mitigate fatigue. Brief naps, ritualized stretching, specific pre-flight routines, or quiet moments of reflection. These measures were small but essential, helping maintain both cognitive function and emotional resilience in a world where the margin for error was negligible. Meals offered respite, ritual, and subtle social cohesion. Stews, bread, and tea were consumed with attention and conversation, often accompanied by discussion of the day's oddities, unexpected weather patterns, peculiar civilian behaviors, or minor mechanical quirks. Humor, whether dark, ironic, or absurd, remained a lifeline, binding men together and providing a shared narrative that allowed temporary relief from stress. Pilots traded exaggerated accounts of near misses, inventive explanations for equipment failures, or fantastical interpretations of enemy tactics. These exchanges reinforced both morale and attentiveness, creating a culture in which vigilance and levity coexisted. Letters continued to tether minds to home. Correspondence, photographs, and small mementos provided tangible reminders of a world beyond flak and tracer fire. Reading aloud, sharing anecdotes, and reflecting on the contents reinforced camaraderie and offered emotional release. For some, letters became part of ritual, examined with care, discussed in detail, and preserved meticulously, providing continuity and reassurance amidst chaos. These connections underscored the human dimension of endurance, linking the present struggle with past familiarity and future hope. Interactions with Allied forces remained rich in both practical and social significance. Joint sorties demanded synchronization, mutual trust, and rapid adaptation. Pilots learned to anticipate behaviors, interpret signals, and coordinate responses under extreme stress. Exchanges of tactics, improvisational problem-solving, and friendly competition fostered both skill and social cohesion. Ground troops provided crucial intelligence, reinforcing the awareness that aerial maneuvers, while isolated in the sky, were inseparable from the larger operational picture on the ground. Each success, each failure, and each shared observation contributed to an intricate web of survival and understanding. Amid this intensity, pilots began contemplating the broader implications of war. Thoughts of home, family, and the possibility of survival beyond the conflict surfaced more frequently. The tension between present danger and future hope created a complex psychological landscape. Excitement tempered by fear, pride intertwined with guilt, humor laced with sobering reflection. Men recognized that each mission was a momentary assertion of agency in an environment largely dictated by forces beyond control. Their routines, rituals, and social bonds were not only survival tools, but also expressions of identity, purpose, and humanity. Trophies, whether captured enemy planes, successful missions, or moments of personal triumph, became markers of resilience. They were studied, discussed, and sometimes celebrated quietly, offering tangible evidence of skill, ingenuity, and endurance. Each object, each story, each minor victory reinforced the understanding that survival depended on a combination of careful preparation, adaptability, and the subtle interplay of social and psychological support. Through extreme conditions, unexpected incidents, humor, fatigue, letters, meals, and reflection, pilots navigated the complex terrain of aerial warfare. Life in the skies was an ongoing negotiation between danger and continuity, where each sortie, each ritual, and each interpersonal interaction contributed to a delicate, evolving balance. Survival was not merely technical. It was psychological, social, and profoundly human. The cumulative experience, marked by both terror and absurdity, discipline and improvisation, shaped men in ways that extended beyond the cockpit, leaving lasting impressions on perception, behavior, and understanding of the fragile yet resilient nature of life.